Okay, hello, Mr. Jacob Magid, if I'm correct pronouncing your name.
That's right, you got
My
it.
name is Berkay. Yeah, my name is Berkay. Nowadays, I'm based in Shanghai, in China, and we want to ask some simple questions about some hot topic about the Israel U.S. versus the Iran war. So, if you don't mind, I'm going to start with some like simple questions. The first question about this one, what are the possible next steps in the U.S. Israel war against Iran?
Sure. Thank you very much for having me. I think right now we're looking at is a deadline that President Trump gave for April 6th. That was an additional 10 days on this ultimatum that he had given. I guess he's now given it in three different forms. It was the first time he said that within 48 hours, if the Straits of Hormuz are not opened, the U.S. would then carry out massive strikes against Iran's energy sites. That deadline was then pushed back by 5 days after President Trump said that there had been outreach, engagement from Iran. They're interested in reaching a deal, and that therefore we would give 5 days for that deal to be made. Basically, a deal that would end the war. The first time where you hear President Trump really giving a clear deadline of when that could be. And since that 5 day deadline, earlier, or I guess last week, we saw an additional deadline or extension given of 10 more days until April 6th to try to get this deal. Otherwise, the U.S. ostensibly will begin striking these energy sites in Iran. And it's something that they've tried to avoid doing until now because there's this recognition that that's not just going to harm the regime, but the broader state of Iran and the likelihood of creating a scenario where you have basically a failed state, which is not really seen as a U.S. interest. And so the hope for the U.S. right now is that Iran will come to the table and agree to some very difficult terms that I don't think it was willing to agree to before. And actually, some of these terms that were laid out in this 15-point plan that's been presented to the Iranians go further than what was talked about before the war in those negotiations that were held in the weeks ahead of the U.S. and Israeli strikes on February 28th. So basically, right now, the hope is that the Iranians will come to the table. There's the U.S. is insisting that they're interested in speaking, but we haven't seen a response yet. The U.S. would like to see an actual summit, possibly in Islamabad, mediated by the Pakistanis, with the several other countries also involved, but the main mediator being Pakistan. And the idea is for basically Iran to capitulate to all these demands surrounding the issues of mainly the stockpile of uranium that Iran still has, of the highly enriched uranium that the U.S. really wants to get out of its hands. And then also other factors regarding its nuclear capabilities, its missile program, its support for proxies, and things of that nature. It's going to be a very difficult circle to try to it's going to be a very difficult sorry it's going to be very difficult to see that these kinds of negotiations bearing fruit just given the gaps between the sides at this point. I think Iran is just not going to agree to something. My understanding, speaking to several officials from the mediating countries, that Iran will not agree to something right now that it wasn't willing to agree to before the war. Now, they were willing to talk about giving up some of the stockpiles of uranium, but things like their missile program and capping it, or the length of the missiles the length of the distance of their missiles can reach, and or their support for proxies, that those had not been issues that they were really willing to seriously engage in. I do think that maybe there's some wiggle room given the massive amounts of blows that the U.S. and Israel have been able to inflict on Iran's military programs. But still, I think Iran is feeling more emboldened with the closing of the Straits of Hormuz, and really the U.S. inability to come away with a clear strategic victory at this point, because for Iran it's just about survival, and the U.S. It's obviously about a lot more than that. So the U.S. just has a little bit less wiggle room to succeed. But we'll see in these next, I guess, over the next week whether there can be, if not an actual agreement on this 15-point plan, then maybe just an agreement to simply stop the fighting for now and then agree to hold negotiations. Because this idea that the U.S. and the Trump administration thinks that you can have just very fast, um, simple agreements that can just come about overnight. Whereas I think these negotiations, if you think about the Iran nuclear deal in 2015, under Barack Obama, that took months and months of negotiations, if not longer. So it's difficult to see a comprehensive agreement coming together right now. But possibly what I've heard from mediators is the hope is to let's try to get first just I guess you could call it a ceasefire and an agreement to hold maybe a framework for future negotiations. That's maybe a more realistic option at this point.
I want to ask about this question, this topic actually. You mentioned about giving a deadline for the Iran by the President Trump. But the Iran's media, Iran's government officer are strongly denying that there is no negotiation between U.S. and Iran. So, do you think there will be impact for giving the extra deadline for the Iran by President Trump?
So I think that there's the sides of different definitions for what negotiations are. There's definitely been a passing of messaging between the Iranians and the Pakistanis and the Egyptians who are also involved, and a couple other countries, the Qataris as well. But the idea that there's actual negotiations happening, that I think the U.S. is using the term very loosely. President Trump, I think, is constantly talking about it as if they're having these in-person talks that just are not happening at this point. But I do think that there's been enough messaging for the U.S. to feel comfortable to expand this deadline twice now. I think part of it also has to do less with the amount that Iran is engaging and more to do with the fact that the U.S. is definitely concerned about the economic ramifications of this war, and it's not a coincidence that these announcements regarding deadlines have been made at points, for example, before the stock market opened last Monday, where there was a lot of concern with the prices of oil that were skyrocketing, and that kind of calmed things down by giving this 5-day extension, and the same thing with this 10-day extension as well. A lot of it has to do with the way the markets are reacting to this war, but I do think obviously Iran has an interest to try to at the same time downplay or pretend like it's not having any sort of engagement when I think it clearly is. I think the officials from mediating countries that I speak to say that as much as Iran is putting up this front that it doesn't want to deal, it is looking for this war to end. It's not looking for the war to end on the terms that the U.S. is offering, and it is willing to go longer and extend this war beyond what the U.S. would like to see for sure. But that doesn't mean that they're simply prepared to continue taking these hits from the U.S. and Israel indefinitely.
You mentioned about that oil pricing is getting raising. Actually, we are just following from mainstream media. Do you think also? I just heard about some protests, like there are some protests in U.S. in many kind of states, like such as smoking's protests. Do you think this kind of protests? I'm not sure if it has a powerful effect on the U.S. political view. Do you think there will be impact for pressuring the U.S. government to make a quick negotiation, quick ceasefire with Iran or not?
Look, I think the protests that we saw over the weekend across the U.S. were under the framework of the No Kings concept, I guess, targeting President Trump, less specifically about the war, but obviously the war gives those who oppose President Trump more ammo against him. But in terms of the support within his base, the MAGA base, it's pretty wall-to-wall support. Yes, there are the influencers that we're hearing a lot about. The Tucker Carlsons, Megyn Kelly, people of that kind who are very much opposed to the war, have been very active on social media against it. But I think the more grassroots, I guess you could call MAGA base, is going to stick with Trump for much longer. I don't think he's concerned about losing that support. But I do think he recognizes the impact on the economy, and therefore the one indicator I think that's helpful to know to look at for when the U.S. is thinking about wrapping this up is this May visit that the U.S. President Trump is trying to make to China in order to meet with President Xi. That's scheduled for mid-May. For that to happen after they've already pushed it off once, I don't think they're looking to make an announcement that we're having it in mid-May without really intending to stick with that date. But in order for that to happen, this war needs to wind down in about a month. I think that would give enough time, about a 2-week period of ceasefire, to then make it safe enough for President Trump to get on a plane and travel all the way to China. A month's a long time. We're already a month into this. The U.S. talked about a 4 to 6 week deadline, and that's been something they've continued to say that we're trying to stick to. But there's some contradictions here because they've talked about how we're very much ahead of schedule. If we're ahead of schedule and it's a 4 to 6 week deadline, then this war should have been over by now if we're at the 4 week point. Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, during a meeting with G7 foreign ministers over, I believe, on Friday, I was told by one diplomat who was in the room, said that we're talking about another maybe 2 to 4 weeks. So if it's 2 to 4 weeks, that's also expanding the time frame from, I guess you could say, 4 to 6 to 6 to 8. So still longer than what the U.S. said initially, which makes sense given the difficulties that I think Iran, or the stamina that Iran has been able to show in terms of not simply collapsing as I think the U.S. had hoped and maybe even assumed, thanks to urging from Israel. And that therefore this is taking a little bit longer than planned. But I still think to jump to a conclusion and call this a forever war at this point, I think it's a little bit difficult to do. But it is difficult all at the same time to see exactly what a clear exit strategy looks like, given the inability possibly to finish this war with Iran still having these stockpiles of enriched uranium on the one hand, and two, still closing the Straits of Hormuz. I think you could see a return to the status quo, but that's going to take concessions on the U.S. side, which is obviously not willing to give right now.
Okay. I want to ask about some ground troops and the massive attack possibility from the U.S. Do you think that will ground troops be deployed as rumored, so it will be a fact, or is this just a part of the maximum pressure campaign, pressure campaign for the ongoing to following the war scenarios?
I don't think this is simply a bluff. I think that you don't send these amounts of troops to the region without an intention to use them. And I think based on the way that the U.S. understands Iran, that it simply will capitulate if you exert enough pressure. I do see the U.S. Prepared to actually, or President Trump to authorize a mission to possibly take over Karg Island, this key location for much of the export of Iran's oil. That's something I think that they're prepared to do. And I was speaking a couple days ago with one of the mediating countries, an official from one of the mediating countries that very closely involved in these talks, or at least the mediation aspect of it. And they're pretty convinced that Trump is leaning towards authorizing that use of military force, a ground campaign. It's pretty remarkable given where he's coming from this campaign in the presidential election, where he talked about not just ending wars that he called forever wars, but also not starting them to begin with. And maybe I'm not sure if there was specific rhetoric against ground troops, but the idea of sending these troops to the Middle East right now is definitely not, I think, what a lot of people were thinking about when President Trump was elected, given the way he campaigned. But obviously, as we've seen in the past, I think his views are pretty fluid on these issues, and I think he still has the support of his base to move this forward. It might be difficult if there are massive casualties, and I think while it might be simpler for the U.S. to take the island, holding on to it's going to be a much more difficult task, and will require a lot of time that I think the U.S. is not going to be wanting to spend. But I do think it's prepared to do so because it simply believes that if you just push Iran enough, that it will simply capitulate to demands. And I think maybe there's a world where certain aspects of the negotiations will be improved as far as the U.S. is concerned as a result of military pressure. I think the Iran's principled stances regarding the need for its missile program, that it sees as a key deterrent factor, especially if it's going to lose its nuclear program, and its belief that it has this right to enrich. I think that you're not going to see a lot of movement on those issues, especially because I think we're talking about not necessarily a leadership at this point, despite that they've killed what Trump says the first, second, and third layers of their leadership. Those who have replaced it are not seen as less hardline than the ones that came before, and if not, and if anything, are probably more hardline because we're talking about people who Mujtaba Khamenei, as far as we know, he's alive, and he's obviously probably looking to exact a certain degree of revenge for the killing of so many of his family members, his father included.
Okay, I get it. The third question about this one, whether there will be a ground troops or some kind of like additional, depends on the additional deadline for the negotiation or just ceasefire. When and under what circumstances might the war end for the United States and Israel? So what do you think about this one?
Yeah, the part of your question I think is more interesting is about the differences between the U.S. and Israel on this, because I think we're talking about, while yes, they are aligned on a lot, and I think there are those who are trying to expand the distance between the two sides, but there is a clear difference between what Israel and the U.S. want on the issue of regime change, where I think the U.S., well, President Trump in his first speech announcing the war did talk about urging the people of Iran to stand up once the bombing ends and take to the streets and take over their government. Since then, there's been the recognition from the U.S. that regime changes doesn't seem to be very likely. President Trump keeps talking about how the people with the guns, which are the regime, are the ones in control, and therefore the protesters can't, as brave as they might be, are kind of helpless in this situation. And therefore, the U.S. doesn't seem to believe that this is really a possibility soon. And there's even been reports about frustration with having been oversold the possibility for regime change by Israel, by Netanyahu, by the head of the Mossad, David Barnea, who apparently reportedly made a pitch to the administration that this was something that was really realistic, that the Mossad could cause within a very short amount of time, right after this war was started on February 28th. I think Israel, on the other hand, would like to see that regime change and is still talking about creating the conditions for it to come about. We have seen Israel maybe step away a little bit from maybe I could say the the way that it's we have seen Israel maybe tone down the rhetoric a little bit in terms of how convinced it is for that it's possible. We heard Prime Minister Netanyahu talk about it much more forcefully initially, and ever since I think in recent days he's talked about, well, we can only do so much on our end. It'll be up to the people. We didn't hear that it'll be up to the people at the end of the day. We don't really know kind of talk. Initially, it was seen as something that, yes, this is the real goal, and we're going to make sure that this is carried out. And I think that's a pretty major discrepancy that is going to be difficult to reconcile. I think the way the war ends. That's going to be something that Israel is going to want to keep going further in order to ensure. And the U.S. obviously is looking to cut and make sure it maintains a certain amount of it doesn't collapse the global economy too much, and therefore is going to be looking to end this earlier than I think Israel would like. And therefore, I think you're seeing this intensification from the Israeli side of its bombing campaign to make sure it gets as much possible done. But at the end of the day, the desire to cut a deal with the regime that keeps it in place and basically strengthens it by holding an agreement with them and legitimizes the regime. Obviously, is not something that Israel would like to see. But at the end, but also Trump is the one who makes decisions.
I want to add some extra question about this one. I have seen some criticism about the killing not of some supreme leaders of the Iran, but some of the symbol leaders of the Iran, such as I can give an example for Ali Larijani. So he's a really massive leader, not leader, maybe just spiritual leader, like under that regime. And it was a little bit criticized why we killed that Ali Larijani, because there's no one that we can be in the negotiation and just making a kind of agreement. And right now, maybe just for 1 week, we are just seeing about some news. And Trump always mentioned about that the leader of the Congress name is Galibaf. So that guy can be a good candidate for making an agreement. For killing or just eliminating this kind of people can be helpful to making some kind of sustainable agreement between U.S. and Iran. Do you think it is possible?
Look, I think the logic that Israel uses to justify these assassinations is that it feels that it's helping collapse the regime. That if you clear out so many of members of its leadership, that these are people that are irreplaceable. That it really will lead to a decentralization of the regime, and therefore will hasten its collapse. I think, but on the other hand, the regime in Iran has definitely been prepared for this. It's the way its systems are built up are to ensure that it can withstand these kinds of decapitations. And even I think before Khamenei was killed, there was already steps put in place to move over a lot of the responsibility for decision making if he was killed to Larijani, as you mentioned, who is someone who's very in touch with a key part of the Iranian system, both at the political and the military levels. And now you have someone in Ghalibaf who is very close to the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and it further strengthens the IRGC's control over the country. I think that we're more likely to see a scenario where Iran becomes more of like a military state and less of a theocratic one. I don't think that military state is any more likely to agree to some of the demands that the U.S. is making. And I think there's a pretty strong assumption to be made that this will lead Iran to actually, instead of trying to abandon its nuclear ambitions, then actually to rush towards them, because the feeling was until now, the idea was that we are just simply a threshold state. that will be enough to deter our enemies from attacking us by not actually getting the weapon, because there are lots of ramifications in terms of sanctions and other aspects that we don't want to have to deal with if we try to get a weapon. And there was this fatwa that had been put in place by Khamenei before he died, or decades before he died. But now that proved to not work, that the U.S. and Israel were managed to strike twice. So the assumption now is that this new leadership, the Khamenei son, they're not going to simply decide to, okay, we're going to abandon the nuclear program now. No, we're going to double down because this is more likely to keep us safe. This is the only thing that's going to keep us from getting attacked again. I think what Iran is going to try is to create a new strategic dynamic for its security after this war that puts it in a better position to ensure that it doesn't get attacked again. Obviously, the U.S. is looking to do something the opposite of that. But I think when one side is more ideological and less cares less about the well-being of its own people. And we saw the way that they mowed down tens of thousands before this war started. And it's just about survival. I think they have a bit of an upper hand in these negotiations.
Mm, I want to ask the last question
Sure.
because I'm currently in China, and we are really curious about the China and Russia's position, especially in this region. Of course, there are some regional powers which is also impacting this war, like such as Turkey, maybe Saudi Arabia, Egypt. What do you think about those big countries, maybe the global powers countries? What's their impacts on this war?
Yeah, I'll preface this by saying I'm really not, I would say, international relations expert. I'm not an expert on China. It's something I cover pretty infrequently as the U.S. Bureau Chief for the Times of Israel, where more focuses on the Middle East. But I think you are seeing, at least, I can speak less about China, but more about there's this, not necessarily a realignment, but a strengthening of alliances of what I guess you could call an Abraham Accords alliance that already existed with Israel, the UAE, and Bahrain. Morocco is also part of the accords in some ways, but for the relevancy to this issue, the Gulf, these two Gulf countries, the UAE and Israel and Bahrain, are, I think, will come out of this working more together. We're already seeing a significant amount of assistance that Israel is providing to the UAE and Bahrain in terms of missile defense to try to shoot down some of these drones and missiles that are coming out from Iran towards those countries. And actually, it's remarkable to see that the majority of the attacks from Iran are actually hitting UAE. Maybe not majority, but that they're the country getting hit the most, more so than Israel. And there are lots of reasons for that. But and that's on one hand, and on the other hand, I think you'll see a strengthening of the, maybe you could call the Islamic alliance of Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Pakistan, and several other countries that are, I think, maybe willing to work with the UAE and Bahrain on certain issues. And obviously, there's a commonality in the GCC. Qatar is also part of this latter Islamic bloc, and they don't necessarily view Israel as the enemy completely, but I think do see Israel at the same time as this very destabilizing factor in the region, and therefore are more comfortable working with one another against to maybe try to curb that influence while also trying to keep the Iranian threat at bay. I think both groups, both of these alliances are anti-Iran, but I think they're going to be more relevant because Iran coming out of this war. Yes, in some ways you could say that Iran is they're able to survive. That's considered in some ways a victory, but I think you are going to see a pretty substantial weakening of their presence in the region for at least for the time being. That doesn't mean they're not going to try to regroup, and that's maybe the argument against these attacks to begin with, because what did you really accomplish if they're just going to keep advancing this malign activity in the region? But still, I think you'll have these two emerging alliances that are going to be a bit at odds with one another regarding obviously the way that they view Israel and whether it can be a positive factor in the region, but also just trying there's this new hegemony that will be up for grabs, maybe you could say, of who can benefit the most from Iran's weakening in the region. Will it be this Abraham Accords alliance on the one hand, or will it be the more Islamic countries that have a different take on Israel? I think they both want to hit Iran hard during the war, but I think you could maybe argue that the UAE is, you can see it publicly, they've been the most vocal about the need to continue the war, not to end it quickly, which I think there is willingness to continue it on the Islamic side. I think there's a lot of anger, definitely behind the scenes at Iran for attacking these countries, but I don't think they're looking to extend this for much longer. There's a lot of economic ramifications that they're not willing to pay. And as you mentioned on China, I guess you could say that this is a war that I think China does want to end quickly, because I think it doesn't see Iran as this key ally, but it is an important part of its own economic makeup. And I think you're going to see. Um, I'm sure this issue will come up when President Trump, if he does able to make that visit to China. I think the continued relationship that China has with Iran, I think you're going to see as a result of this war, maybe they'll look elsewhere, be it in the region or to Europe, for a lot of its oil exports, given how destabilizing that Iran has become.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you very much for your time. Very,
Yeah,
very important.
thank you. Thank you for having me.